It's not 5 o'clock, and they don't care. Welcome to Wine to 5. Entertainment, education, and everyday drinking for everyday people. Your hosts are Valerie Caruso and Stephanie Davis, two wine educators who don't need a clock to know when to pour that next glass.
Thank you for joining us today for another episode of Wine to 5. And oh, by the way, it's International Women's Day while we're recording this. I'm your host, Val, and I'm celebrating with my co-host, Steph.
Hey, Val, and cheers to all the ladies out there. And instead of talking about mimosas on International Women's Day like we did 2 years ago, that was back in episode 48, we are podcasting about port from Portugal. But before we start our overview of Portugal's prized wine, tell me about what kind of glass is that? And what have you got, Val?
This is my Danone English bone china cup that I bought, about 18 years ago in England. And it is relevant because while port seemed like a good choice for this podcast, I do have to get somewhere later. So I thought, drinking this morning probably wasn't going to be a good plan. So I have a Silver Needle Baihao Yinshen tea. This is considered a very prestigious high-grade Chinese tea from the Fujian province. The flavors of this tea are very delicate. They're floral. There's some white tree fruit and citrus. It's really beautiful. It's one of those really feminine teas, I think, and it's just so elegant. And this is when they harvest this tea in the spring. They take these beautiful silver leaves, and this is a loose leaf tea. So you see these long, inch-long silver needles. That's what they look like, and they're dried out on bamboo mats or trays, and we get ours from Yezi, Y-E-Z-I. They're our supplier, and they have their own tea farmer, I guess, named Yu Shuichao. And I'm sure I'm butchering your name, Yu, but I really love this tea. And I thought, well, the English own a lot of the port houses anyway. There's a lot of English history intertwined with port. So I thought I could get away with it. And it is just delicious. But I understand you've got some port up there in your glass today.
I do. And you are getting away with it. I just want you to know that. So I have Sandeman Founders Reserve. Okay, so I did find a port I was willing to open for the show because it's only $14 a bottle and it's going to last me about 4 weeks, which is nice. So I might just actually put a little date on it so that I remember. But I'm sure after 4 weeks I could tell already that I didn't want to drink it. But it is 11 o'clock in the morning. And Val and I don't mind drinking at this time as long as we don't have a whole lot going on afterwards. But
right.
This is one of those kind of hybrid almost sort of a style, but it's ruby style. However, it does have one of the teacup closures, and it's a blend of various wines that have an average age of around 4 years old-ish. So that's not like a hard and fast thing. But this wine is very fresh and has a youthfulness about it. It's cold stabilized and filtered, ready to drink now. It doesn't improve with age. The characteristics that I'm getting from it are dark cherries, some raspberries, little chocolate sprinkles on top, that kind of a thing. And definitely something I imagine would go great over some ice cream at 11 o'clock in the morning.
Oh my God. That's one of my favorite chocolate dessert pairings is a good port. The ice cream and the chocolate cake. Mm-hmm. So that is your chocolate wine, people. It's really good. It's also great with cheese too, but we can get into that later. But let's talk about what port is first, because I think sometimes people get confused about it. And I've seen where people come into the wine shop and they're intimidated at the shelf of port.
Yeah, and we both thought it was strange that we hadn't had an episode yet about port. So we're going to do our best to do an overview of port, and we do plan to have some more port information in future episodes. So if you're digging it, you'll get some more. But here we go. Real port comes from Portugal and is classified under a category of wines known as fortified wines. That is fortified, meaning by adding a neutral grape spirit or brandy, and they call it in Portuguese aguardente, meaning burning water. And they add it during the fermentation process. And so that's what stops the fermentation. And so it adds a lot of strength to the wine and raises the alcohol level, kills the yeast, so they stop fermenting, and then you're left with this sweet and intensely flavored wine because it's intense with alcohol, but also has the sweetness. That is why port is generally sweet. Although there are some dry styles depending on when the fermentation was stopped, and usually, like the one I've got is 20% alcohol here in front of me. It's usually between 18 and 20%.
As we did mention, port does come from Portugal, and more specifically the Douro Valley, which is divided into 3 main regions, and each of those regions has unique climates. So, of course, Baixo Corgo, which is the closest to the sea, closest to the Atlantic Ocean, and the furthest west, is going to be the coolest and the wettest because of that maritime climate. But as we go east toward the Spanish border, then we get into the hotter, the drier regions, and this is where your premium growing areas are. These are where you see those beautiful steep slopes, and they've got that rain shower. There's a mountain range there that gives them some protection from the Atlantic Ocean and the storms and rain and everything, that little rain shadow. So this is why these grapes can really ripen and offer a lot of flavor and texture and good stuff to the wine. But also there's the river. That is so important because the producers used to send their wines down to the port city of Vila Nova de Gaia and they would age their port in these large 550-liter barrels. But what's also interesting is the history. You guys have seen pictures of the foot stomping that goes on in Portugal, and they still do it. These giant concrete troughs, they're called lagares. And there is archaeological evidence dating all the way back to the 3rd and 4th centuries. Port itself, however, only dates back to the 17th century or the 1600s. Then there was fighting over the centuries. They were raising tariffs on French wine, and then the French weren't allowed to send any more wine to England. So the Englanders were importing more port, and then to meet that demand, there became scuffles over the quality of the wine, and there were more treaties over the trading and more things happening. Of course, all good wine students are going, oh, so you're going to talk about the Treaty of Methuen in 1703. And this is what bolstered the port wine making because it offered a duty discount on Portuguese wines as opposed to the more heavily taxed French wines. So this kind of went back and forth between the 1500s and the 1700s, but it all started to kind of level out around the 1700s. And so I didn't want to go century by century here. Also during that time that they started stabilizing the wine with the brandy. Because what would happen when they would ship these wines to England? They would hit the waters, the wine would show up, and it would be ruined or spoiled. So this was all happening during the 17th century, which is exciting. Back to the 18th century, of course, the fortification of the wines was becoming more common practice. And the English appreciated this because they liked that sweeter, fuller-bodied style. There were some winemakers that weren't having it. However, they said, oh no, it adulterates our fine wines. You're not adding brandy to our wines. You're going to mess it up. But by the 1800s, it became pretty much SOP, or what we used to say is standing operating procedure. So you combine that process of fortification with this ridiculous harvest of 1820, and that pretty much set port on the path to what we know it today, this beautiful, little bit of elevated alcohol, rich, unctuous wine. And of course, during the 20th century is when we saw the development of more demarcation. And I did fail to mention that the original demarcation did happen in the 1700s. And it does have the distinction of being one of the very earliest denominations for wines, but that kind of developed more in the 1900s, and so we're not going to get too much into that. If you go to Portugal and you sail down the Douro River and you see these beautiful steps, what they call the patamares, and these were constructed once the bulldozers came around. So yay, we got bulldozers now. We can build these slopes. And it was Ramos Pinto's Quinta that was one of the very first ones that they built these dirt ramps, and they hug the contours of these steep slopes on a diagonal. And I've got my hands hands waving around like you can see it, like I'm demonstrating, but it's so beautiful when you see these vineyards. And they had these tiny little Lamborghini tractors that they use to harvest the sites. And then finally in the 70s and 80s, you see these vertical rows that go up and down the slopes. It was Ferreira and Ramos Pinto that kind of helped implement those. And those are known as Vino at Alto. So Steph, enough about history. Let's get into the grapes here.
Yeah, you can have some tea.
Oh my God. Yeah, and exactly. And that's only like half of what we have written down. But I'm like, yeah, nobody wants to hear all that. So, yeah.
Oh, well, it's hard to go over everything about port in 30 minutes. But the grapes, we'll do a little grape gab here. The top 6 are Tinta Roriz, which is actually just Tempranillo, Touriga Nacional, Tinta Franca, Tinta Barroca, and Tinta Cow, which translates to the dog strangler. Again with the dogs, just like last week. It's funny.
With the Uva Cane last week, and now we got, the Tinta Cow.
Yeah. So, but there's over a dozen red grapes authorized, including Bastardo.
I just like the way it sounds, Bastardo.
I like it too. That might have to be its own grape gab. But wait, there are white grapes too. The main ones being Gouveia, which is also Verdelho, Malvasia Fina, and Viosinho. But there are over a dozen of these authorized too. Okay, so we're not going over all of the grapes, but those are the main ones.
Where the rubber meets the road is when it comes to buying and enjoying port. And this is probably why you listened in the first place and hopefully haven't turned us off yet. Because we must distinguish between the two different styles. Because you're going to look at this wall of port and you're going to go, wow, there's ruby and there's tawny. And the bottles don't say this is bottle-aged port and this is wood-aged port. Well, some of them do. But bottle-aged ports, these are your ruby styles generally, okay? They're usually aged in bottles after a maximum time in wood, again, depending on the style. For example, you're going to see these LBVs out there, these late bottle vintage ports. You see them in certain classes of air travel, which they serve with cheese, which is awesome. And they spend an average of about 4 to 6 years in wood before bottling. But a regular ruby or ruby reserve, like something Steph's drinking, usually spends only about 2 years in wood, but could spend more. Mm-hmm. Okay. But there's also something called a crusted port. This is a vintage style. Now, it's a little bit cheaper than a vintage port, which we're going to talk about in a minute. And the difference is that it's a blend of a couple of harvests. It's not a single vintage year that's been declared, but it's been aged in wood for a maximum of 2 years, bottled, not filtered, so it's going to throw sediment. And there are rules for bottle matured being on the label in this case. And most are released at about 6 years. So if you see a crusted port, you're going to see the bottle matured situation on the label. And a lot of times you'll see bottling dates on some of these wines as well. Now, when you buy a vintage ruby, it will have sediment because it will have spent more time aging in the bottle. They start to look more tawny or garnet as they age. And don't we all? And they age for decades normally. But it's not so much from oxidation as is with the case of wood-aged tawnies. Also under the ruby category, you're going to see something called a single quinta vintage. It's like a vintage, but it comes from a single quinta, which is a producer. And all the grapes are picked from the same year. So these are made more often than vintage port because if a vintage isn't declared for an overall region, then they go, oh, well, we're having an exceptional year. We're going to declare our own darn vintage. And bam, there's
That's
your
right.
SQVP. So these also spend about a max of 2 years in the wood pipes. And so they're bottled young, but sometimes they won't be released till like a decade or so after bottling. But the bottom line is vintage rubies, open them, decant them, drink now or forever hold your peace. And Steph's going to talk about that here in a minute. All your other rubies, you have about a week or so. Okay, once they're open. So, again, it depends. Because then you've got these wood-aged ports. And these are released also when they're ready to drink. And this is where you're going to find your white ports or your tawny styles. These do not throw the sediment. These do not need to be decanted, as Steph will explain later. And you can keep them open longer, which is nice. But you'll see the tawny, which has to be 2 years in wood. And you'll see those at the lower end of the price scale. often. You also have the Tawny Reserve, which is going to spend a minimum of 7 years in wood. But then you're going to see these age-indicated tawnies. And I took a picture of 2 bottles I have. I have a 10-year and a 20-year, I believe. So they're bottled at 10, 20, and 30, 40 years. The indicated age, let's say a 20-year, is an approximation of what a 20-year-old tawny should taste like, not the average of the blended wines in the bottle. And this is why we chose 20 as the example, because it is preferred by many port lovers. It's one of my favorite for its balance of fruit and maturity, and it balances out that affordability factor, Steph, wouldn't you say?
Totally. Because, I mean, like a 40 is going to be a lot more expensive. I mean, upwards of, almost $100. It just depends on, who you're buying. But yeah, 20 is a good price point.
Yeah, so that's kind of like if you want that complexity and that, that tertiary flavors that come with age, then you're gonna, want to balance out the costs also, and you're gonna spend money on a 20 year, and you can keep that open for almost a month. So that's pretty cool. But then there's a little something called a colheita, which means harvest. And I always think of the Simpsons, colheita. So that's a bottle that's a wine that's been 7 years in wood, but it's from a single vintage also. So similar to a vintage ruby, only it spends more time in wood. So these are released when they are ready to drink. They are not going to improve with age, unlike many of us, again. And they also won't deteriorate quickly. Again, unlike many of us. So your tawnies, once you open them, you're not going to have the sediment. You don't need to decant them. You can keep them open for a little bit longer, preferably in the fridge. But there's one animal out there, the rare Garrafiera, and this creature is a single-year port. It's aged 7 years in wood, 8 years in demijohn, which are these giant-looking glass bottles, and then decanted after 20, 30, or 40 years before being bottled. So this is one of those hybrid things. It kind of reminds me of like the Amontillado of the sherry world.
Right.
Yeah, so the Garrafiera of the port world. So it's a hybrid of a combo of wood-aged and bottle-matured.
I'm guessing it says Garrafiera on the label, right?
I've never seen one.
Yeah, okay, I've never seen one either, and I'm wondering if it would.
I would hope it would. We can Google that and find out. But the white ports, you guys have seen them. You've seen them in bars. They mix them in cocktails. I think I had one up in Seattle at Purple. But the white ports can also spend a little bit of time in wood. They can also boast the reserve label after spending 7 times in wood. They can also have age indicators as well. These make aperitif wines that are absolutely outstanding, and a lot of times they serve them with tonic and a slice of lemon. That's kind of the classic way. Have you ever had some of those, Steph? I'm sure you have.
I've had white port, but I've never had it as the cocktail with tonic before.
Yeah, I think it was Purple where I had it, and I believe it's the only time I've had it, unless it was in a cocktail and I don't remember. Mm-hmm. But how about a rosé port? Have you ever seen those?
Not yet.
These are a unique animal also. This is a Croft thing. So Croft is the one that came up with this back in 2008, and it's technically a light-colored ruby. That's all it really is, and it's kind of a marketing thing. It's just capturing a younger share of the market. They're making cocktails with these things, but yes, that is a very unique thing. And each producer is going to have their own stuff, like the one you have there.
Right.
They can be like hybrids of the different styles, but overall, what would you say your takeaway would be to remember the styles?
Well, I think that, you have to just divide them into the 2 major categories of wood aged and bottled aged, and then you can kind of follow along, or do you decant or do you not decant? And I know we mentioned it once, but this is a lot of information. Some people might want to listen to this episode 2 or 3 times to get it all. But the general rule is, the vintage bottled ports are the ones that should be decanted. So they're the bottle aged vintage dated, and then the wood aged ports are ready to drink. You don't decant them. There's no sediment. And the wood aged also have the greatest shelf life, like we said. They have a teacup closure, and that's why you see them at the restaurants. Because you can get a glass at the end of dinner or whenever you so choose, but it'll last a long time for the restaurant, and the bartender doesn't have to be tasting it all the time. But bottle-aged ports are closed with a traditional cork, And sometimes, that's also from Portugal. That comes from one of those countries, but can be tricky to open if the bottle is super old and the cork is really crumbly. And I know that's happened to me a number of times. I've had some friends open some old vintage port and it's just a mess. And nobody had port tongs.
Oh, talk about those.
Yes. And so what's cool about port tongs is that you can get the cork out of the bottle I've got to tell you how it works. And I have a video too to show you that is pretty cool. It's from 11 Madison Park, so you can see the real deal with a sommelier. But so the basics are you heat up these port tongs and you put them around the neck of the bottle underneath where the cork is. And you press firmly once they're really, really hot, like they're supposed to be like red hot, Then you get some ice water and you just barely need to wet the glass right where those hot tongs were. And the glass will completely break clean and there won't be any glass in your wine. And then you're ready to decant. So it's really slick. It's like a party trick, really. But, and you can warm these port tongs up, whether it's in a fireplace or under a flame. There's very different ways you can do it. And also keep in mind, though, that if you've got this old bottle of vintage port that's got a lot of sediment, you need to stand up the bottle so it's upright for a few hours ahead of time so the sediment goes all the way to the bottom before you dive into it. But the other important thing is about, making sure you're keeping these bottles in cool cellar conditions like all wine. And then in general, you serve ports at a cellar temperature. And, not the white port, which you're going to serve cold. But there is a really cool site that Val found, the IVDP that she mentioned earlier, which is the Porto and Douro Wines Institute. And we have links to it, but they actually go in very detailed specifics on what temperature each kind of wine should be served. They also go into detail about how long they'll last once they're open and food pairing ideas and cocktail ideas even. So that's a link there for you. Check that out in the show notes. Another general rule is about what glass you should use when you're drinking port. And a white wine glass or a port glass is preferred, but it's not recommended that you use cordial glasses or dessert glasses because you can't get your nose in there and swirl around and really get the aromatics and appreciate the port. In the glass, vintage port that is bottle aged, and I like to keep repeating that just so that people really remember, but it's the color is this dark garnet to purpley color, and it will have integrated fruit structure, strength. It'll have flavors of raisins, spices, prunes, all over the place. Espresso, chocolate. I mean, it's pretty amazing, right?
Oh, I love it.
It's pretty amazing, and you're paying for that. Don't forget. And it's the best of the best when it comes to ports, and only about 1 to 3% of all ports produced are vintage port. And I think, they say usually only like 3 years in a decade are declared. Mm-hmm. But tawny ports are much different. Their color is different and their flavors are different. They have a golden brown or amber color and have nutty oxidized flavors of caramel notes, toffee, fig, lots of vanilla goodness. And those wines can also just be swirled and sipped, and they're intriguing at times. I mean, we were just talking about the 20-year, but I had a 40-year to celebrate a friend's 40th birthday 2 years ago that I can still think about.
Yeah.
But port, whether it's 11 o'clock in the morning like it is here, or any time of day, you can enjoy port. I think port doesn't necessarily like having the image of being a dessert wine exclusively. And so it's nice that you can find it in some cocktails now, and people are doing different fun things with it, let alone cooking. Cooking with port has always been a thing. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so it's not right or wrong with food pairing. I know people go a little bit crazy for some certain port pairings, but you can just drink it by itself.
Yeah, it is one of those wines you can just sip in front of the fire, or like I said, I love it with cheese.
Yeah.
Especially like a Stilton cheese and port. That's like a classic pairing anyway. So port and Stilton. And when I see that offered on the menu, I get really excited about it. But if you want to learn more, definitely go to the IVDP website. It's Port and Douro Wines Institute. And I've got this amazing book here. This is by Richard Mason, and it was written in 2013, but it's called Port and the Douro. And this is an outstanding resource. It has the vintage charts in it, service, has a little poem about drinking at 11, which is really cute in it. 1 at 11 or 11 at 1. It's really cute. But all the different information on the producers and, you know, their history, directions, contact information, service, maps, pictures, you name it. This is a fantastic resource, and I was happy to pull that out again because I haven't visited it in about 2 or 3 years. And as far as our factoid today, let's get into this factoid, shall we, Steph?
Yes.
Port. I hear people say all the time, oh my God, I was out in Western Colorado and they make port. I'm like, it's a port style wine. Here's the deal. As of 2006, the word port is only supposed to be used for wines produced in Portugal in the specifically delimited geographical region. Now, again, we kind of glossed over the 335 stones that made up the original region in the 1700s and all that, but it is a specific growing region that port has to abide by. And, you know, we could totally get into that another day. However, in 2006, there was an agreement that the semi-generic words like port and sherry and things like that, if somebody in the U.S. is making a wine or a port-style wine, if they've been making it since prior to March 2006, they can still call it port. Otherwise, it's not allowed. And nowhere in the world are they supposed to be doing this either. So in the U.S., we're the only ones that if you've been making a port-style wine prior to 2006, March 2006, and you call it a port, then you can still use that word. However, this is not port. This is a port-style wine. Doesn't mean they're not delicious. I've got a few in my cellar from California, from Amador. I love Stories. They do one made with, I think, Zin or Mission grapes. I can't remember which, but they're delicious. They're just not technically port. So that I think is important to remember. And I'll link up the TTB regulation on that as well. So if you're doing it before March 2006, you can call it port, but it's kind of like champagne that kind of came in there too. It's like American champagne or California. It's not champagne. So,
right.
Yeah.
Right.
That's just a little distinction there that I hear about all the time. But what about the Wino Radar stuff?
Well, since we're recording on International Women's Day, we thought we'd share a 2017 blog post called Conversations with Women Winemakers in Portugal's New Douro. So we have a link here. It is a post that is researched and written by Professors Lucia and John Gilbert from Santa Clara University. And one of the subjects that Lucia studies is women's career paths in male-dominated fields. And I think that their website that these two run, called the Women Winemakers of California, is pretty cool because I found so many great articles in there that all have to do about women winemakers and women in the wine business. So if that's something you're looking for as a resource, I think they're doing an excellent job. They don't necessarily write all of their articles. Some of them are links to other sites, but it's a great place to start. And there's some search options that are cool too.
Very cool. I didn't know that existed.
Yeah. So I didn't know it existed either. And I thought it was really, really pretty sweet. What about some shout outs this week?
Yeah, and shout out to all the stuff that we learned just doing this podcast and all the resources that we have access to. I mean, this is incredible what we're learning and getting to share with everybody. And another one of those resources, of course, is Five Senses Tastings. So just a few days ago, we got to have we do our little quarterly meeting in Denver. We kind of call it a mini retreat, and we do some podcast planning. And we also got to meet in person our guest from episode 117, Kala Maxim. She is fabulous, and she's the chief event composer of Five Senses Tastings. We shared a killer bottle of Godello from Bodegas Godeval while sitting at the Blue Island Oyster Bar and swapping entrepreneurial stories. And so big love to Kala. And we also recommend eating at the Departure Lounge if you're in the Cherry Creek, Denver area, and healthy food at True Food. We could not get enough of that healthy menu. Oh my goodness. But before we move on to Patreon love, let's raise our glasses to the 35 fine ladies that we've had on this podcast. We aren't going to read all the names, but we are honored that each and every one of you spent time with us across Skype or in person. So congratulations on all your achievements, ladies, and happy International Women's Day.
Cheers.
Cheers.
And thank you to our patrons who support us on the crowdfunding platform Patreon. Our Reserva Superiore supporter, Robin Sauls from Girls Gone Grape. Our tenacious tasters, Jeff E. from the award-winning We Like Drinking podcast. Lynn from Savor the Harvest. Sebastian of Sassy Italy Tours. Jen in Maryland. David and Lisa in Illinois. Anne-Marie in Virginia. And it's not 5 o'clock, and we don't care because it's 11 o'clock. Meg in South Dakota, Clay in Arizona, John Andrew Iswani in California, Chantel in Ontario, Mary Lou in Pennsylvania, Kathy in Georgia, Chris and Janet and Diane in Colorado, Steve and Renee in Illinois, Kathy in Tennessee, Ashley in North Carolina, Sean in Ohio, and our tastemaker listeners, David in Scotland, Carol in Kentucky, and Karen in California. If you'd like more details, please visit patreon.com/wine25podcast. And you too can be entered into our monthly drawings and also get exclusive content and swag.
And we're here for you every single week. Between episodes, you can find us in the social spaces at Wine25, and we encourage you to join our private Facebook group called Wine to Five Community. I'm Val. You can connect with me on Twitter at WineGalUnboxed and as Vino with Val on Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest. Connect with Steph online everywhere as the Wine Heroine. But until next week, happy International Women's Day and cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening to the Wine to Five podcast.
I need more.
Be sure to check us out at Facebook/WineTWO5 and tune in next week for more fun and useful sip tips.